Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Jeff Burns, who's president at Kenco Material Handling Solutions. And today we're going to talk about material handling and fleet management, uncovering opportunities for cost savings and other business benefits. Now, supply chain logistics executives are today under a lot of pressure, not only to meet more demanding customer expectations, but to do so in a cost-effective and a profitable, manner. And, therefore finding opportunities, to manage costs and find productivity improvements is more important, than ever. And one area that certainly has a lot of opportunity, but maybe a lot of companies overlook is in the whole material handling and fleet management aspect of their supply chain. So what kind of opportunities are available and what kind of benefits can companies achieve in this area? Well, that's the key question we're going to answer in today's episode. And it's great to have Jeff on the program to kind of share his perspective and insights and advice on this topic, since he lives and breathes this every day with the companies he works with. So Jeff, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Adrian. It's a privilege to actually sit here and talk with you and talking about something that I get very excited about and have been chasing here for a long time. So I'll be interested to hear your questions and looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great. Well, Jeff, we've had many of your colleagues there at Kenco on the logistics side on the program over the past few years, and but you're the first-time guest here on Talking Logistics. And like I always do before we kind of dive into the topic, I always love to learn how people get into this industry to begin with. So why don't we start briefly there, just to kind of get a little bit of context on your background. Tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved in logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Kenco.
Interesting. I started my career off as I'm an industrial engineer by school with my degree, and had been in manufacturing really up until basically out of college and until 2002. And ran across, met a friend who actually was working at Kenco. And at the time I was needing to probably switch the company I was currently working at. And he said, "You're an engineer?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, Kenco's hiring engineers." And I go, "You guys are a warehousing company and you have engineers?" And so anyway, so that's how I came to Kenco. And from 2002 until 2005, I worked on the supply chain side as an engineer and in operations. Then in 2005, I was, it's kind of interesting. I thought I was actually brought over to the dark side of the company. And because, basically, Kenco is really known as, from their distribution and warehousing transportation over to the material handling side, which is where I've been since 2005. And now I couldn't imagine doing anything else. It's a very exciting business. And one of which I wake up every day excited to come into work to try to accomplish and solve, fun and complex problems. So that's how it happened for me.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I'm an engineer by background as well, so I'm always amused and impressed when you see all these engineers, and I came out of manufacturing too. One way or another end up in this industry. And I guess to the latter point, talking about the dark side, if you will, in the material handling, I think that's an area that, again, I think, we need to shed more light on, because there's a lot of opportunities there. And certainly that's part of the goal in today's episode. So that leads me really to my first question. Let's start by defining, fleet management. I think when, transportation folks hear the term fleet management, they probably think about, trucks that they use to make, pickups and deliveries. And certainly that's the first thought that pops into my head. But material handling and distribution folks, for folks in that area, fleet management means something else, right? What does it mean?
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about the material handling industry is there are very few people out there doing what we would call fleet management. And we define fleet management as essentially cradle to grave oversight of rolling stock. And that rolling stock will be defined as equipment that would be inside of a distribution center or a manufacturing location, possibly even out into a lumber yard or a brick yard, stuff like that. And we talk about rolling stock, we're talking about forklifts or material handling equipment, anywhere from personnel carriers, your yard spotters, your cleaning devices like sweeper scrubber, even up to like aerial products, your boom, scissors, and so on and so forth that a company will utilize inside of a manufacturing indoor distribution location. So when we talk about fleet management, that is, for us, it is the oversight and the management of all of those things. And what we have found in our industry, there are very few people who are actually tracking that information, tracking that data, tracking the spend, tracking productivity, utilization, and so on and so forth. Things that we'll talk about here a little later. So that's how we define it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, you really think about all these different assets. Really, I mean, in some ways, it's almost like asset management and asset lifecycle management, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, around all those pieces of equipment, and so when you look at a manufacturing company or you look at a distribution center, I mean, what are some of the main challenges companies face, related to fleet management?
Well, one of the things our industry, and I don't believe this has been purposely created this way, but our industry is naturally creates blind spots for customers. And so what's happened is over the years of the material handling industry, the OEMs or the manufacturers of the equipment have created protected territories. And so what happens is when you take a national company or even like, for example, a North American company, what happens is for example, a customer who may have sites in the Northeast versus, the Southwest versus, somewhere in the South, maybe Midwest. What happens is no one's talking to the other. And the reason is because a lot of times, particularly in manufacturing, decisions are made locally. And what happens is this, when decisions are made locally, then essentially the over, arching sort of view, or this 30,000 foot view of their material handling equipment, is essentially lost. Now, so what happens is because of that lack of visibility, then standardization is almost irrelevant or actually not even possible because no one's talking to the other. The other thing too is then utilization of equipment, lack of uniformity across the equipment. So then what happens is no one's sharing equipment, and so because of that, there's this natural blind spot for our customers. And as a result of that, with decisions being typically made at the local level, then companies are spending more on their material handling equipment than they actually need to be. And so what we typically see when we go in and do an analysis for a customer, it is very, very simple to get to 10 to 15% savings. And we have actually experienced, savings of 20, 25% across their fleet. And some of it's actually very simple stuff. It's stuff that even the customer themselves could do if that's something that they have the capability or someone with a bandwidth who actually could do this. It is simply getting a view from a 30,000 foot level, what you have, what you own, and who's using and or the different types of material handling equipment that you own.
It's interesting because we talk so much about visibility in supply chain and logistics, right? And a lot of the time around visibility, it's around a visibility to a shipment, the visibility to an order, where's my truck,
Right.
And as I heard you talk about this, I mean, here's the visibility. This is a different type of visibility, but one that's just as important as all the other types of visibility that we talk about in this industry, which is really having visibility to these assets, and then looking at the data, right, or the information that you have to really uncover opportunities for cost savings, for efficiencies, and so forth. Because it sounds like, just to paraphrase a little bit what you said, is that it's very fragmented, it's very siloed, the way companies approach this because of some of the characteristics of of the industry. So even just getting a handle on, I would think that even just getting a handle on how much do we spend a year on this type of equipment is not necessarily an easy question to answer, right?
No, it's almost. We've been doing this since 2010, and probably I've had two customers who I asked the question, "How many forklifts do you have? And what are you spending?" And I've only had 2 customers actually be able to, or potential customers or clients, say they actually or could actually give me that information. Because again, like you said, this is something that they're just viewing as a necessary evil. This is a tool that we have to do our job. And as a result, no one's measuring.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I guess if they were to try to go and find that answer, they would probably have to make, 10 different phone calls. There'll be 10 different spreadsheets that they would get back, and then they would have to try to merge those 10 spreadsheets, right? So yeah, a lot of, phone calls and spreadsheets floating around.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And when we actually first sit down with a client or a potential client, then what happens is we begin to go through this. We've actually now created a template for them to actually collect that information because a lot of times they actually don't even, a lot of times the customer really doesn't know what they need to be gathered. And so as a result, we sort of built an aid so that to actually help them gather the information. So it's very, very common.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that very interesting. And I'm sure that one of the questions that always comes into play, and I'm sure it happens here, particularly when any kind of equipment is, do we buy, do we lease, do we rent equipment? I mean, is this I would assume that this is not necessarily an easy question to answer, but how do you go about, answering that question or make those decisions? I mean, what are some of the factors that come into play? What kind of information you need to kind of understand the whole, lease, buy, rent decisions?
Right. Well, and it is actually an easy question to answer. However, each customer has, their own philosophy of how they actually procure, assets, whether it be over-the-road tractors or material handling equipment, so on and so forth. However, but inside the material handling industry, it's a math equation, and it really has to do with the utilization or your hours that you're operating the equipment. In our industry, kind of 2,000 hours is sort of a rule of thumb, kind of, I guess, standard that we work off of. If you're operating, in the high, near 3,000 hours per year, 3,500 hours per year, you probably should buy. Because what's going to happen is if you go seek a lease, the advantage of leasing typically is that it should cost you less because the OEM is going to put a residual on there through their financing entity, and it should reduce your cost. The problem is if you lease and you're running high hours, then the problem is that your residual is going to be lower, and more than likely you're probably going to have penalties at the end of that lease. And a lot of times those are surprises to customers. And if you've ever leased a car and you went and turned it back in, sometimes you may get a surprise. That happens very frequently in our industry, and something that must be really accounted for. The other thing too is that if you operate your trucks less than 2,000 hours per year, you can begin to look at leases, but then you also possibly may want to consider rentals. Because rentals are good when used properly. They are not good by the end customer when used improperly. Typically, when we calculate our lease rates, we're going 3 to 4 times what it would. Our rental rates. We're going 3 to 4 times the value of what you would pay for a lease. Obviously, we own the asset. You need it, and so in those instances, you need to be very careful how you're employing rentals across your network. The interesting thing is, though, is in today's nature, or that companies are dealing with, is the fact that no one can buy anything, and so but everyone can rent. And so what we see is when we go in and do an evaluation, we'll make our point of contact at corporate, typically who we're dealing with. We go out for site visits. We come back and they go, "Are you aware that you have 10 rentals in this location?" And they go, "We have no clue." All right. And so as a result, they are paying 3 to 4 times what they should be, when in reality, they probably could be leasing and or purchase a piece of equipment. It really is, it comes down to just basically a math problem when you look at how often are you using this equipment. And so that's sort of how we go about looking at whether you should rent, buy, or lease.
Yeah, no, and I think it goes back to what we talked about, previously. I mean, if you don't have that visibility and that understanding in terms of your equipment needs, or how much equipment you have, and how much you're using and utilizing them, and
Right.
kind of how that stacks up against the rules of thumbs that you have, for those different breakpoints, if you will. You could be all over the map and kind of leaking money out, money out the door because you really haven't done that analysis.
Right. Yeah. It's as they would say, low hanging fruit, right? And from an industrial engineer standpoint, I mean, it's the easiest savings possible. I often find it funny. I said in a lot of meetings, and I said in a lot of meetings with our logistics company, with Kenco Logistics Services, and I hear how they're continuing. I mean, everything is measured from the 3PL perspective, right? And oftentimes we'll have a proposal in front of a customer where we could literally save them 10, 15% over, a $5-10 million spend. And we're, and it's hard to get everyone to understand because no one's really has considered actually can improve my material handling equipment, but I'm going to go over here and I'm going to beat up my 3PL, right? In regards to, well, you employed too much labor here, or, this, that, or the other. So it's kind of funny, which is exciting for us because we're on the cusp of something I believe is new. It was funny, when you and I originally exchanged emails, you were thinking about fleet as over the road tractors, right? And so not a lot of people are talking about this. And so it's exciting for us to sit in front of a customer and just ask them those series of questions and to hear them say no. And it's great because then we have something where we can actually come and help the customer. And there are instances where, we just sat in front of a customer and we've helped them and they went out and done it themselves. And this is not something that, again, this is not rocket science, what we're doing here. It's just complex because of the size of it and the fact that no one's measuring it.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that measurement piece in a little bit here, but I think everything you just said is just spot on because I think particularly there's so much buzz and talk today around what's happening in transportation, for example, right, with increasing rates and fuel beginning to go on the rise and everything else. So everyone is kind of hyper focused on that in terms of how to what are we going to do to control our transportation spend. But to your point, here's an opportunity that they're probably overlooking or ignoring, and where they can get some substantial savings to counteract what's happening on the transportation side, as an example, which might be more difficult to solve, right, than solving.
That's exactly right.
Or capturing these opportunities here.
Yep.
I think related to the whole lease buy or rent, question is, obviously end of life, right? I mentioned before, in some ways when we were talking about this, this sounds as asset lifecycle management in some ways. So I'm sure as equipment ages, you face, kind of new questions, right? Do you repair a unit? Do you retire it? Or do you buy a new one? So I would think that lifecycle management is another important component of fleet management, right? And then what's involved in doing it right?
Well, it's the central piece of what we do. In most instances, when we come in and we take over a new account, obviously we're taking something over midway through a lease, or, they've owned the equipment for 6 or 7, 8 years, so on and so forth. And we begin to track data. And throughout our database that we've been now building since 2010, on almost, I guess, every manufacturer that goes, across our industry, then what we begin to find is, okay, where are the failures occurring? And then at what point should you begin to look at, okay, let's retire this asset? And it's again, not simplifying this, but it's very simple. It's, what we call it is a washout analysis. And in that washout analysis, basically you're tracking what you're spending to repair and to keep this piece of equipment operating. You're also looking at your uptime. How often is it, are you able to actually employ this asset to actually go out and do what you purchased it for versus when it's down? And so then basically through that math problem, when the two cross, when it costs more to repair it and to keep it up and going, added in with your uptime, then that will begin to determine, okay, when do we actually retire this asset? And so most companies we find, there are several philosophies. Some want to have, state-of-the-art equipment. They want to flip their trucks every, 3, 4, 5 years. They lease them typically. We have customers also who want to run them until they're 10, 12, 13 years old. And in many instances, that's being done without data. Matter of fact, almost consistently, it's being done without data. And without data, then you make decisions that are uninformed. And so it's just a very simple calculation or essentially comparison of when you should retire that asset. And so that's the central piece of what it is that we're doing, and that is we're measuring the data, and that is from everything from the hours that it is used down to the point of exactly how many filters did we put in this piece of equipment, or how often has this failed, and then at that point, then the decisions are easy. Now, they may not be easy to corporate level from a standpoint of availability of funds and so on and so forth, but knowing whether you should do it becomes a very simple answer.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like, this is an area where, another one of those terms that we talk a lot about in this industry is business intelligence and analytics. So I think this is yet another perfect example of if you're collecting, the right data and you've got a history and a pool of that data, you're able to make, very, informed decisions, around, some of these questions that we just talked about. Maybe after this conversation, you can apply some of your methods to determine whether I should, retire my my Subaru that I have, parked outside of the driveway. Whether I should keep plowing money into that old car, or right, start leasing a new one, or maybe buy another one. So,
yeah. Well, interesting. I'm quite certain your checking account determines that.
And it does. It does. Yes, absolutely.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. As should it at a company. Unfortunately, the decision makers typically may not see the checkbook from time to time. And so these are very practical decisions, but spread across a network of 20 distribution centers or 15 manufacturing sites with thousands of employees involved. The problem is the person controlling the checkbook doesn't always see what's going on, 2 states away. And right, thus it becomes complex.
Yeah, no, and I think the picture you just painted, I mean, I think if you were only operating one facility, and you could probably put your arms around it a little bit better, but obviously the bigger you get, the more, facilities you have, the more equipment you have. I mean, it just becomes much more, complex if you don't have that proper foundation to, gather that information, gather that data, so then you can at least give yourself the opportunity to do the analysis and make those decisions.
That's correct.
So let me go back to the measurement piece here. I mean, how do you measure success when it comes to fleet management? I mean, what are some of the key performance indicators that or metrics that companies should be looking at?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are numerous, and in our industry, there are people, they define them as sort of different terminology, so on and so forth. But ultimately, what you're looking at from a fleet provider, as well as your local provider, one of the things that must be always taken into consideration is your PM completion percentage. Okay, because just like your been told, since the automobile was invented, you need to change the oil in the engine, and just like your car, that preventive maintenance program needs to be in place. There are also rules set in place from OSHA, standards that need to be, that ever so often this piece of equipment must be maintained from a preventive maintenance standpoint. Safety checks must be through that PM program. What should take place is basically all points checked to actually make this equipment extend its life, as well as everything is in operation that the manufacturer created to keep it safe. That everything begins around the PM. The other is that as you get into the facilities, then what you need to be looking at is your abuse versus your normal versus elective maintenance. Abuse is a huge indicator that the piece of equipment is being operated improperly. And a lot of times, your end provider will not give you that information because that's more money for them. So what they want is they want the equipment to be, damaged or to be, operated incorrectly, because then that's more opportunity for them to bill, to repair more, replace more parts, so on and so forth. But you need to be looking at what is abuse versus elective versus what is normal maintenance on the piece of equipment. The thing that we live and die by through our database is cost per hour. Okay. And that essentially rolls into everything, into the total cost of that piece of equipment. Everything from the parts that are put on it, the labor hours that are used to put the parts in and repair, as well as lease / whether you possibly may be, depreciating that asset. However it is you do, you need to understand the cost per hour. And in many instances with our customers, we actually calculate that down into the fact of, okay, whatever it is they're making. Okay, so this rolls in and helps them be able to begin to actually price what it is they're selling more accurately, because this is what it costs to operate a forklift. This is what it costs to have the sweeper scrubber in my facility, so on and so forth. Other is utilization, right? Utilization begins to tell you, how often this piece of equipment is operating. Numerous times customers tell you, oh, we operate our trucks 3,000 hours per year. Well, that may be when the key switch is on, right? And in many instances, the key switch is actually it's keeping up with hours, but you're actually not using the piece of equipment. So in reality, you are affecting your lease turn-in if it's a leased piece of equipment, because it's typically based on hours. And so then you need to begin to see, okay, really, how much am I actually utilizing this piece of equipment? And so your fleet provider should be able to give you that information. I guess the other thing is, when you're working with either your fleet provider or your local dealer, you need to measure first time repair completion percentage, right? This all affects your utilization, your uptime with your equipment. What you want is a provider who can come in and reduce, if there is a repair that needs to be made, then it needs to be repaired right the first time. Otherwise, what happens is that you have more unneeded or unplanned, non-value added time. And so those are very key in our industry. This is what our software that we actually have developed inside of our company, that we track these things. And then we push this to our customers, or they're able to pull however they choose to actually elect that option. And then this is setting in front of the decision makers, so that they can see, number one, how we're performing for them. Number two, how their equipment is actually being used, and then hopefully, as our relationship grows, all of these KPIs and the discussion that we've had previous gives them more insight into what it is and what it costs them to actually ship and or manufacture the product that they're making.
Yeah, no, a lot of great metrics there, and it just kind of shows you kind of if you're going to do this right, what the level of detail that is required to really get as much of a true handle right on what the costs are and what the utilization rate is and so forth. Jeff, as kind of coming up short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question here. As a way to wrap up, I mean, what are some of the key capabilities then that companies should have in place or look for in a partner, such as yourself, in terms of, let's say, people, process, technology, to make sure that the fleet management operations are optimized and delivering maximum benefits? Yeah,
well, I think number one is industry knowledge, and then a proven, I guess, a proven record of actually being able to manage across state lines and or a regional area. And in many instances, many of our companies here in America actually are up in Canada as well as down in Mexico. And then the ability to actually be able to collect that information. One of the things, what we're doing is we're gathering information in many instances. There are a lot of great companies out there who do this, who actually gather the information. One of the things that I firmly believe in, the data is more accurate when you're collecting it yourself. And so what we do is we actually put boots in the facility. And so our method that we move forward with is actually we will put on-site technicians, and or we will have a technician in the area that's feeding us the information. And then that's collected inside of a database, essentially inside of our software, that we use to actually intelligently give us that information. But what you need is someone with that proven ability to actually come in and explain to you where the holes are. And if someone comes in and sits down and talks with you about your fleet, interestingly enough, we have dealerships as well. And we were invited in to present as a subject matter expert to a very large worldwide company, and we were asked to go in, and we weren't allowed to sell. The only thing was I couldn't sell, which is very hard for me not to do. So we went in as a subject matter expert, and immediately we get 10 minutes into the presentation, and they said, "Well, how do you know this, and how will you? So just sell us." And I'm like, "Okay. You've asked me to sell, so now I'm going to sell. How do you know these things?" I said, "Well, as soon as I walk out the door, I'm going to turn my hat around backwards put my other hat on, because I'm going to actually do everything that I've just told you not to do from a dealer standpoint." And so it's a whole different mentality. So when you begin to look at selecting a fleet provider, you need to have a full understanding of what their mentality is. Is their mentality to sell you more lift trucks or more equipment, or is it to reduce your overall spend? And so I probably can't have this with actually having a saying that Mr. Kennedy would say. Mr. Kennedy was the founder of our company. He had a saying that he said that pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. What you should look for is look for someone who has that mentality, right? Not someone who actually wants to come in and sell you lift trucks, but someone who wants to come in and actually improve your process. And that's difficult in our industry right now, because there's not a lot of people doing this. And so we're very excited about this new industry that we're niche that we're kind of carving out in the distribution/manufacturing world that our products operate in.
Yeah, no, very, great words of advice there, and food for thought. Going back, and maybe, something you said there in terms of, having technicians on the ground and capturing that data. So how is the data captured a lot of times? Is it, manually in terms of folks seeing what's happening? Is there a lot of IoT going on here as well, where the equipment is actually reporting back data in an automated fashion to a database? All of the above?
All the above. The fun thing is that the material handling industry is probably, I joke about this all the time. We're 10, 15 years behind everything else. Now there's a lot of cool things that that forklifts do now that they didn't do 10 years ago. But if you look at what over the road tractors or your automobile is doing, we're just now beginning to catch up with that. Telemetrics is a huge buzzword in our industry. Where basically you're gathering information from the equipment. The one thing that we haven't been able to actually solve, I guess, is how you capture the information when you actually repair the unit. And so that's where how that's done. It can be done in numerous ways. We actually, from our dealer side, we're forced to send our work orders to data collectors who essentially have a software package where they're actually just managing the data. And we have national customers who actually we have to send that information to. And so they're gathering it from our actual repairs, where we actually employ, we utilize just iPads or tablets with our technicians, where they're actually inputting the work order so that we get a little more real-time information. But basically, and then that's fed into our database that creates essentially our capture of the information. But that, it's not very sexy, and we're hopefully trying to catch up. But the OEMs, the manufacturers, have another 3 or 4 years, we're probably going to see much more intelligent information coming from our lift trucks. It's on there now. The problem you have is tying into the customer's network, and if you've ever tried to do that, that gets very tricky because now you're starting to talk. You're actually asking them to open up their network for you, and a lot of customers don't want to do that, and rightfully so. Then if that doesn't work, now you're talking about a sell signal, and then you're adding an additional expense. And so we've got to solve this as we move forward. It's coming, and it will be exciting when we actually have sort of caught up with the rest of the technology in the world. So.
Great. No, Marcus, I mean, I think going back to the initial part of our conversation, having that visibility is really dependent on having that data, right? And then
Right.
How you capture that. And I see that as well. I think that the technology is going to continue to evolve to make that process, much more automated, much more accurate, much more timely, to do what you do. Jeff, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics, but I certainly learned a lot today. I'm sure our viewers did as well, and you provided some great food for thought and insights into this whole area where there's certainly a lot of opportunities for cost savings and other business benefits. So thank you again for making the time to be with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a great time, Adrian. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I love. Thank you.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Kenco website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Jeff, you can post it there. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.